you like to live in a universe presided over by someone who on the one hand says he's our Father, on the other says, if you don't obey me, I'll kill you, how long would you stay home if your father told you, remember when you were children, at breakfast one morning, you say, you're old enough now for me to tell you the truth. We've had such a happy time together, but I have to tell you some serious things this morning. From now on, if any of you fail to obey me, I'll kill you. And you want to know how? You think I'll just put you to sleep? Some form of euthanasia? Be too good for you. I will torture you to death in the most painful way I know how. And I think sulfurous flames would be just the thing. Believe it? But what is our explanation of why the wicked die? Does not God burn them in sulfurous flames? Not forever. We have good news. Not forever. Only as long as you deserve. Why doesn't he just put his sinful children to sleep? Well, then the rest of the family wouldn't take sin seriously, would they? But by torturing them, by the good members of the family hearing the agonizing screams of those who are being tortured to death, that will help eliminate sin from the universe, will it not? Wouldn't it in your home? If you still have little ones there and they're not behaving too well, try it tomorrow. Take one of them out on the lawn and torture him to death, and then say to the others, I hate to do this. I want freedom and love in my home. But any more disobedience, that's what I will do to you. Justice requires it. Other than that, you're perfectly free, and I do not wish you to serve me from fear. It doesn't make a scrap of sense. When was this answered? Are we not on the verge of it being answered? Has anybody ever died the death that is the inevitable and awful consequence of sin? But can you see all the theology that's involved in that? What is the death that is the result of sin? What's different about the second death? What's different? There is no recovery. Did Jesus die the second death? But did he recover on Sunday? Then did he die the second death?
Yes, he did.
But the second death is you can die Friday and rise Sunday. That's not too bad. If the price of sin is to die and stay dead forever, we're not paid up. How do you know it was? How do you know justice was satisfied? Because God said so? Well, then if all we need is his statement that justice is satisfied, he didn't have to demonstrate anything. You mean if Jesus hadn't died, God would not have forgiven us?
How could he?
How could he? That's why he was on the
cross. Who would stop him?
Pardon?
You mean he's not forgiveness personified? The father of the prodigal son said, I'd love to forgive you, my wayward son, but until your older brother volunteers to die for you, I cannot forgive you.
It took the shedding of blood to atone for our sins.
Why so? Why?
You got me.
Well, you know, we're all old friends here, and we've all grown up with this, haven't we? You've had it longer than I have. I think, you know, it's good to ask ourselves about the things that mean the most to us again and again and see if we can find better ways of saying it. And every time I come to Gethsemane and the cross, I like to ask myself again, to what is he speaking? I mean, why is he doing this? What is revealed by the death of Jesus? Why is there no other way? In other words, there is no other way because there is no other way. So we don't have any understanding as to why there is no other way. There just is no other way. Has God sought to invite us to understand why there is no other way? See, if I don't need to understand why there is no other way, he didn't need to tell me at all. He could have just said, by the way, I've cared for all this privately. Why has he invited us to understand? Yeah. Our evangelists have an invitation, which is most appropriate. They invite their audiences to come and stand at the foot of the cross. I think that's inviting them a little late. I think we ought to go with Peter, James, and John to the Garden of Gethsemane, for that's where the dying began, isn't it? And if we don't doze through it all, we would watch Jesus begin to experience this awful feeling of separation from his Father. And it is so terrible that he falls dying to the ground. Is it your understanding that if the angel had not come to strengthen him, Jesus would have died in Gethsemane? All All right. Did the Father kill his Son? Did the Jews kill his Son? Justice? Can justice kill anybody? Justice is a word in a book. It's an idea. Justice can't kill anybody. Separation.
Ellen White says that the bloodshed in Gethsemane would have been sufficient if they had accepted him.
Then why did he go out to Calvary?
Because they didn't accept him anyway.
You mean if there had been acceptance between Gethsemane and Calvary, those few brief moments...
Gethsemane would have been sufficient.
But who knew what he was doing in Gethsemane?
Well, did they know what he was doing on the cross?
But I mean, did anybody have an opportunity that was turned down?
His three disciples were there, witnesses.
And they slept through it.
Well,
who did watch Gethsemane? The whole family of the universe watched Gethsemane, and they got the message, you can be sure, because they could look into the face of Christ and see him suffering so. And they could look into the face of the Father, who was suffering so. Now, can you, on the authority of Scripture, tell me how the Father felt while the Son went through this? Would he be crying, how can I give you up? How can I let you go? But you see, this depends on how we fit it in all the details up to this point. And lest we not do it aright, Paul hastens along very shortly with his inspired explanation. And at the very beginning of Romans, Paul explains what causes the death of the wicked. He says God's wrath is poured out on them. But what does that mean, God's wrath? Paul explains several times in Romans. God's wrath is simply and sadly his giving up those who do not want him anyway, thus leaving them to the inevitable and awful consequence of their own rebellious choice. God turns away and gives up those who reject him. Well, was Jesus treated as if he were a rebel who had rejected his Father? Was he not made to be sin, though he knew no sin? Did the universe not understand that Jesus was dying the death of a sinner? Had anybody ever died that death before? Well, a lot of people had died before. Then didn't all the deaths from Eden to Gethsemane prove that God had told the truth, the wages of sin is death? Could have. Why wasn't that enough? If that's the only question, is it true that sin leads to death? Thousands of answers, millions of answers. In fact, God made sure they had some answers. He drowned all but 8. And they could turn to God and say, is that what you mean? That love me or I'll drown you. And then when Sodom and Gomorrah were burned, they could turn to God and say, is that what you mean? Love me or I'll burn you. Or when the earth opened up, is it love me or I'll swallow you up? And they could have gone from one story to another in the Old Testament. Obviously, all those deaths which were at God's hands did not answer the question sufficiently. Because is there not a question that goes along with it that affects our relationship with God more than anything else? Has God ever said, love me or I'll kill you? And yet, you know, that is fundamental to most Christian theology, unbelievably. It is assumed that God is the one who kills his wayward children at the end of the millennium. But it's all right because it's just. But it will inspire fear for eternity. Now, there's no question God has put to sleep millions of his children through the Bible. Now, the devil has a ditch on either side of the road for this. He has those who teach God never has put anybody to death, like the firstborn in Egypt. Then you have a real problem. The devil does all God's killing for him, which is a very common picture of hell. Have you ever seen a picture of hell with God prodding people into the flames? Who does the prodding? It's always the devil. So this is an old idea. The devil does God's killing for him. And that's worse, that God is too pure to torture himself. He hires the devil to do it for him. It's even worse. No, God himself put the firstborn of Egypt to sleep, and he'll awaken them. And maybe some of those boys will be saved. Who knows? That's up to him. They didn't die because they were bad. They died because they were the firstborn, to say something. So the deaths in the Old Testament didn't answer the question. Is God going to be the one who puts his children to death so painfully at the end? Because Peter says they'll even the elements will melt with fervent heat, doesn't he? There'll be fire, all right. The earth will need to be recreated. Does God burn his children to death at the end of the millennium? If so, the rest of us, if we're all paid up and our legal standing has been adjusted, We'll be spared, but we will live with a God who says, go on loving me, or I'll do to you what I did to the rest of the family at the end of the millennium. And that kind of obedience that comes from fear can produce the character of a rebel. There is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out all fear. I'd be scared of a God who'd say, you behave for the rest of eternity, or I'll have to do to you what I did to the others. Remember. Now, has that been answered? The deaths of the millions who died of old age and disease and in battle and at the Lord's hand in Old Testament times does not answer the second question. Is death the result of sin? Yes. But is it torture and execution at the hands of our gracious God? How do you know for sure? Did Jesus die the death of a sinner? Did God torture his son to death? In the Garden of Gethsemane, nobody touched him. He wished somebody would touch him. He asked the three to come and be with him, and they slept. Nobody was with him. All by himself, he was left to reap the natural results of being a sinner as if he were. Now we know he was not a sinner. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he fell dying to the ground, the angels saw it, and they saw Gabriel speed down to strengthen him. And had he not gone, he would have died. And that answers question number 2. Yes, death is the result of sin, but it is not torture and execution at the hands of our gracious God. The Father's crying, and the Son is dying, and the Father is not hurting his Son, but he's sadly giving him up as if he were a sinner. And he's reaping the natural consequences of this being given up, sadly, as if he were a sinner. And the angels understand this, and now they'll never serve him from fear. When they see the wicked die at the end of the millennium, they'll know God is not torturing his children to death. He's simply giving them up and handing them over to the inevitable consequences of being rebelliously out of harmony with God. And the glory of him who is love will consume them because they've chosen to be out of harmony. And God's crying, how can I give you up? How can I let you go? Why will you die? And the rest of the members of the family, if they have any remaining questions at the end of the millennium, can look at the wicked perishing and then turn and look at God. And Jesus will still be in his human form. And Hosea says he'll be crying, how can I give you up? Why will you die? I could heal a lot of you if you'd only trust me. In fact, if one of you would cry for help right now, I'd stop the whole thing and go and get you. You know he would. That's what the prodigal son's all about. But nobody responds. It's not an angry face. It's the same kind face. And he's saying, I have to give you up. I never knew you, or you never were friends of mine. And they perish. There's just one thing that would be confirming to all of this. What if God could demonstrate the truthfulness of what he's warned us all through the Bible? That if we misunderstand the death of the wicked, and because we think God has said, love me or I'll kill you, we should be led to arbitrary submission and obedience out of fear. If only it could be shown that that kind of obedience that springs from fear actually turns us into his enemies. If that could just be demonstrated. Now, who could do that? He was strengthened in Gethsemane to go out to Calvary to answer question number 3. Once again, he died that awful second death. It is the death of being given up. Once again, they saw him dying. And he died so quickly. He didn't die crucifixion. The soldiers were surprised to find he was already dead. They thrust the spear in for confirmation. He was dead. You don't die that quickly. That's why they come and break legs. They didn't need to break his. He was already dead. And the universe watched him go through it twice. Once again, he was given up by the Father. And he knew he was. What did he cry as he died? Why are you torturing me to death? Why have you given me up? Why have you forsaken me? And he died of a broken heart, apparently separated from his Father. But he also was tortured. Who tortured him to death? The most devout group of seventh-day Sabbath-keeping, tithe-paying, health-reforming, Bible-quoting Adventists the world has ever known. They did not know God. Remember Amos and Hosea and Micah and Isaiah and Jeremiah? They all talked about this. obeying God without knowing him can actually turn us into his enemies. And it had to be underscored that they were absolutely dedicated to obedience. Jesus kept commenting on it. You tithe mint, anise, and cumin. You strain out gnats from your goat's milk. You search the scriptures, he kept telling them. And then after they had tortured him to death, what was their next concern? To get home in time for sundown worship. For you see, it was the Sabbath. And we are God's true people. And what's the mark that we are God's true people? The keeping of the seventh-day Sabbath. But they kept it as an arbitrary requirement. And I would warn us, if we keep the Sabbath just because we're told to, just as a sign, instead of protecting us in the time of trouble, it could leave us vulnerable, because it says the wrong thing about God. And our very Sabbath keeping, if it's for the wrong reason, could leave us open to the deceptions of the adversary. Merely to keep the seventh day does not mean we'll accept Christ when he comes. Because the folk who rejected him were the most devout Sabbath keepers you ever saw. Now, are we keeping Sabbath for the right reason? Or reading the Bible in the right way? He said, you search the scriptures because you think in them you have eternal life. You quote it from beginning to end. You memorize it. But the scriptures testify of me, which you will not come to me that you may have life. I believe that the three most fundamental questions in the great controversy have been, did God tell the truth? Because if not, we can't trust him. Did he tell the truth in the beginning when he said, this is a free universe. I value nothing higher than your freedom. All I ask is trust and love. But if you prefer to go some other way, it will lead to nothing less than death. It's that serious. Has he told the truth? But what causes the death? Does justice demand that God torture his children to death for refusing to love him? But you men who've passed through this, did it ever occur to you to take your beloved by the scruff of the neck and say, look, you either love me or I'll kill you, and I won't make it easy. I'll torture you to death. Now, let me try again. Will you be my wife? Why, wouldn't you ladies run for your lives under those circumstances? Who do you suppose has taught the idea that justice demands that God torture his children to death? It'll be fair. You'll only be tortured as long as you deserve. That's all. Where did that come from? Ellen White says nothing has turned more millions against God than that idea. Has it been answered, not in words, but in an actual occasion? Did God come and say, watch me die? Did anybody take his life from him? He said, I'll lay it down in myself. The angels knew that it was God who was going through this. And it gave them the answer. Yes, death is the result of sin, but it is not torture and execution at the hands of our gracious God. Why does he want us to understand that? Why is he willing to pay such a supreme price that we may understand that clearly? Because the obedience that springs from fear, that he might have said, love me or I'll kill you, produces the character of a rebel. And in these last days, how stunning to hear Ellen White say that more than once. And in the little book that I May Know Him, page 120, she says, sullen submission produces the character of a rebel. Such a one would sin and disobey if he dared, but he doesn't dare, he's scared. His rebelliousness is only suppressed, waiting to burst forth at any time in bitterness and complaint. Such obedience brings no peace or quietude to the soul. I'm paraphrasing it. It's even better than that. And God demonstrated to the family, I do not want you to serve me from fear. Because if you do, you'll not be my friends. You will be my pious, pretentiously pious enemies. Now, why do we Adventists obey? Is it clear to us there's not a streak of arbitrariness in our God? And of all the commandments, the least arbitrary to me is the seventh-day Sabbath, and I wince when it's ever described as a mere arbitrary test of obedience. It could leave us vulnerable, just as the Jews were back in these ancient times. And to this present day, do we really accept what he came to reveal at such infinite cost, that he does not wish to be served from fear? The Father will no more kill us at the end of the millennium than he killed his Son, which leads some to believe that he did kill his Son, as he will kill the wicked at the end.